Good evening, good evening, good evening. We'll be talking about evening shortly. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? That was Rabbi Eitan Katz singing Ein Kelokeinu, the Carl Bach melody to it, a beautiful prayer. There is no one like our Lord. There is no one like our God. There's no one like our King. There's no one like our Savior. Thank Him, bless Him, acknowledge Him, etc. How are you on this fine Tuesday evening? We've got a beautiful daf, a lot of wisdom to cover. Let's light up the darkness. Who's going to be joining us as we do a little learning together? Tonight we're going to be particularly learning about how we refine our speech. Beautiful, beautiful teachings we're going to have. Yehudit Sobel from Florence, South Carolina, Paula from Chicago, Stephen from New Hampshire, Chaim from Charlotte, Melissa from Great Neck, Christo with us from Lubbock, Texas, Pauline from Arkansas, Fred from Miami Beach, Ann from Merced in California, Linda from Florida, Hannah from Mississippi, Sheila from Montana, Jim is with us from Florida, Donna from North Carolina, Jim from Indianapolis, Christo loves that intro countdown. You've been away for a while, Krista. Welcome back. It's great to have you with us. Fred loves that too. Rochelle is with us from Modesto. And Maggie Lynn Scott from Ostrander. And Sharon from Lebanon, New Jersey. Over there on the YouTube side, we've got Shira from Dallas, Texas. Lynn in North Texas in a tornado warning. May you be safe and everybody be spared such a calamity. And Marjorie from Williamsburg, Virginia. Welcome, everybody. Great to have you with us. All right, where are we holding? We are in Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud. We're on Daf Gimel, that's page 3. We're in chapter 1. We're still discussing the first Mishna. The question that we asked yesterday, that our Mishna asked, or that the commentary on our Mishna asked, right? This first Mishna says that on the or of the 14th, or meaning the Hebrew word or, which means light, right? So on the light of the 14th of the Hebrew month of Nisan, which is the day before Passover begins, we search for leavened bread in our homes by candlelight, meaning we search out anywhere where little pieces or crumbs of bread might be in our homes, because we're going to make a thorough removal from our homes of all leavened bread before we enter the festival of matzos. So right away, we have two questions that come out of this Mishnah. What does it mean, the light of the 14th? Does it mean the evening, the beginning of the 14th day of Nisan, since all days in the Jewish calendar begin at night, the night before, as it were? Or does it mean the morning of the 14th, since it's the light of the 14th, might imply that it means when sunlight returns to the world in the morning? Or does it mean the evening, meaning the evening before that morning? Which is it? And since we're having trouble deciding which is it, does light mean the evening or the morning? So the second question is, why was the Tana of our Mishnah, a Tana is a rabbi from the Mishnaic period, as opposed to an Amora, which are the rabbis of the Gemara, of the Talmudic period. So why did the Tana of our Mishnah use this language that seems a little bit ambiguous? And so now we're having all these arguments. Did he mean the evening? Did he mean the morning? Why didn't he just say on the evening of the 14th or on the morning of the 14th? So those two questions are going to be answered today on our daf. Here we go. So we've been bringing, and yesterday we started bringing a series of proofs, both from verses in the Bible, not just in the Torah, but also in Tanakh, right? So from the prophets and from the writings, so the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings make up the Bible, right? So we brought some proofs from various places in the Bible, and as well from other teachings of the Tanaim, other Mishnahs and Baraisas. And we're still searching for a proof text that's going to say, okay, we got it. We understand that or of the 14th means the evening of the 14th, or it means the morning of the 14th. Already the Gemara concluded, I think twice, yes, we have arrived at a definition. It means the evening of the 14th. And yet the Gemara was not satisfied. Usually when we're trying to figure out what a word or a phrase means, and we arrive at a proof text that seems dispositive, and then the Gemara says, indeed, learn from this example. So then the discussion ends. We move on because we've learned what we needed to learn. But here it says, indeed, learn from it. And it goes ahead and brings yet another proof or another objection. And this continues today. So on our page, or starting actually just at the bottom of page 2, so we have another proof from the example of the when they announced the new Hebrew month. So the Hebrew calendar is a lunisolar calendar, meaning that the months are based on lunar months. A new month always begins on the new moon. So the Rosh Chodesh, the head of a month, is when there is a new moon. And yet, unlike, for example, the Islamic calendar, which also has it based on lunar months, but they don't adjust it to the solar year, and that's why Ramadan, keeps moving around. Sometimes it ends up in the summer. Eventually, after a while, it's in the winter. But Passover, for example, is always going to be a spring holiday. So even though lunar months are either 29 days or 30 days, because really a lunar month is almost exactly 29 and a half days, then we have adjustments every few years in the lunar calendar where we add a whole month to it. So instead of a 12-month year, we have a 13-month year, and we add a second month of Adar. That's the month that has Purim in it. At any rate, so the way that now the calendar has been sort of all figured out mathematically, and you can predict when every Hebrew month is going to begin. I mean, you can look it up online if you're curious, when your Hebrew birthday is and when your Hebrew birthday is going to land, on what day of the Gregorian calendar it's going to land. And, 50 years from now, you can look it up, no problem. But in ancient times, it was not like that. In fact, the way that it worked, and this is how the Torah says that it should work, is that witnesses would go out and look at the moon. And what they were looking for is that very first crescent, that when the moon is starting to increase again, right? So when we're just past the new moon. That would tell them that night had been the beginning, right? That when we get just past, when that first crescent starts to appear, it means that the new month has begun. And then they would come to the Sanhedrin, the sort of council of sages in Jerusalem, and say, we saw the shape of the beginning of the new month, that crescent shape. And then at that point, the Sanhedrin would declare Rosh Chodesh. It is the new month. Now, once they declared it, so it was morning, right? The witnesses would come in the morning to see the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin would declare, so today is the first day of the new month, right? It happened last night, as it were, and today is the first day of the new month. Now, everyone knows that after 29 days, the next day is either going to be the beginning of the next month, or that's going to be an additional day on the outgoing month. And then the next day after that is going to be the new month, because the Hebrew months are either 29 or 30 days long. When the witnesses came in and they looked at some figures, actually that had illustrations in the council of the Sanhedrin, they would show them so that the witnesses could prove that what they saw was right, sort of where the crescent of the moon was on the orb of the moon and in what part of the sky, and depending on the time of year, there were just only certain places where that crescent shape could be, just to test that the witnesses really saw what they saw. Then the Sanhedrin would say, okay, it's the new month. And then messengers would fan out over Jerusalem. But to get the word out beyond Jerusalem, so then at the end of that day, when the evening came, right? So they said this was the first day of the month. So that evening is basically going to be the beginning of the second day of the month. But at the or of the additional day, but meaning once it became night after this first day when Rosh Chodesh had been declared, they would light bonfires on the mountaintops. And those would be visible from very far away. And then actually they would, at the faraway places when they saw the bonfires, they would light their own bonfires. And then this signaling system of bonfires would announce far and wide through the Holy Land, okay, the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem announced the new month. When did they do that? On the light of the additional day. Now, clearly they weren't doing that in the daytime because the bonfires would not be nearly as visible at a great distance in the day as they would at night. So this was a signaling system that everyone knew that they did this at night. And since in the teaching about the messenger and the signaling system to get the word of the new month out to the provinces, as it were, that it was written, they did that on the light of the additional day. So now we have a proof that in these rabbinic teachings, when they say the of a particular day, they mean the night and not the morning. And the Gemara comments, indeed, learn from it. So, okay, we've proven it. We've established the word light, when we say the of a certain day, means the evening time, the night time, not the not sunrise, not the daytime. Is the Gemara satisfied? No, it is not. It's going to bring yet another proof text. Where am I in my notes? Okay, wait a minute. Okay, so then there was a dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Excuse me. A dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the followers of the early sage Shammai and the followers of Hillel. And they argued about a woman who miscarries on the of the 81st day after she delivers a baby. So this is a woman who had a baby, and then she's going to have a period of 80 days where the offerings that she brought, because when a woman has a baby, she brings certain offerings of thanksgiving in the temple, right? So she brings certain offerings in Jerusalem. And if she should get pregnant again and have a miscarriage during those 80 days after she's brought those offerings to give thanks for the baby that she had, so she's exempt from bringing further offerings, because when a woman miscarries, this is all when the temple is standing. We don't bring offerings now. But when the temple is standing, even if she miscarries, she has to bring offerings again because, it wasn't alive, but, a human was delivered from her. However, if that happens within 80 days of the last time she delivered a baby, then she's exempt from bringing any new offerings. That's for 80 days. Now, if it happens on the of the 81st day, right? So 80 days have been completed, and then that night, right after the 80 days are completed, that night is when she has this miscarriage. So Beis Shammai say she's exempt. It's close enough. She doesn't have to bring an offering. And Beis Hillel say she does have to bring an offering. And so then when they dispute this, when they're debating this point of law, Beis Hillel said to Beis Shammai, what difference does it make? It's the 81st day. What difference does it make whether it's the of the 81st day or the day of the 81st day? So clearly, from the question that's being asked from one group of sages to the other, there's no in terms of whether she should bring in offerings. What difference does it make whether she miscarries on the night of the 81st or during the day of the 81st? From the context of this question, clearly, the light of the 81st means the evening of the 81st, the night of the 81st. And the Gemara says, indeed, learn from this. We've got it. The of a particular day means the evening of that date on the calendar. Is the Gemara satisfied? No, the Gemara is not satisfied. It's going to bring yet another proof. Let me get it in front of me. Okay, so there are many different types of offerings that were brought in the temple. Most offerings were brought during the daytime, and some of those offerings had that a part of it could be eaten, right? So there were certain offerings where either the priest could, some offerings like an olah offering, an elevation offering, is burnt entirely on the altar. Other kinds of offerings, some of the meat is given to the priests and they can eat it. And yet other kinds of offerings, I think the peace offering, the people who bring it, some of it goes up on the altar and they can eat the rest of it. And of course, the Passover offerings, just the blood goes up on the altar and then the people eat it. But with respect to most offerings, they're able to eat it for a day and a night. It's right. So if you're allowed to eat it, then the time for eating it is the day that you offered it and that night. And when you get to the morning of the following day, it's no longer permitted to eat it. Anything that's left over must be burned. With respect to peace offerings, you can eat it the day you bring it, the night after the day you bring it, the whole following day you can eat it. But then when we get to that second night after the offering, what is that? That is the or of the third day, right? So there's going to be a third day when it's prohibited to eat those offerings. The peace offerings can't be eaten on the third day, nor can they be eaten on the or of the third day, which must mean the evening of the third day. Those kinds of offerings can't be eaten at that time. And from this discussion, we have a definitive proof. Or of the third day means the night of the third day, not the daylight, not the daytime of the third day. The Gemara says, indeed, learn from it. We've proven it definitively. Is the Gemara satisfied? No, the Gemara is not satisfied. It's going to bring yet another proof from the liturgy of Yom Kippur, where it says on the or of Yom Kippur, there's a special Amidah, a special version of the standing prayer, which includes many additional sections for the Day of Atonement. And again, it proves that the or of Yom Kippur means the night of Yom Kippur, not the daytime. Still, the Gemara is not satisfied until finally, the Gemara is going to be satisfied when it brings a teaching from the school of Shmuel. And what does the school of Shmuel say? It's talking about the very law that we are discussing here, that on the or of the 14th of the Hebrew month of Nisan, we search for chametz in our homes by candlelight. But in the version taught by the school of Shmuel, they don't say the or of the 14th of Nisan. They say on the evening of the 14th of Nisan. And since it's the very same teaching, now the Gemara is satisfied. Okay, we agree. The or of a date, when sages are saying the light of a certain date, they mean the evening and not the morning. It could not be spelled out any clearer than this. Shmuel is a great sage. They learned it from Shmuel. This is the way the school of Shmuel teaches this teaching. They say the evening of the 14th. So why do the Amoraim, why do the rabbis of the Talmud spend so much ink and so much breath and so much energy coming to a definition of the or of a certain date? Why is it so difficult to just, definitively say that the light of a certain date means the evening? One answer that's offered is, it's not like you have a sages union that establishes language standards throughout the whole world of the sages. There are different sages teaching in different localities, and they're trying to have a uniform law, and that's why they're debating it for centuries so that they can arrive at the halakha and becomes the established law, for all the Jewish people. Nevertheless, all this, kind of critical debate and discussion is going on in different localities over large periods of time. And so the Gemara says, in some places, when they're talking about the evening of a certain date, they say Lila. They say the night of that date. And in other places, when they're talking about the evening of a certain date, they say the light of that date. And for them, it means the evening of that date. It's a kind of just custom of location, right? It's a custom of the locale. Well, but they knew that. they know that in different places it means different things. So maybe since this is such an important teaching, and it's the very first line of the entire tractate about the laws of Passover, maybe that would have been a good place when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was putting together the Mishnah to be as clear as Shmuel would eventually be in Bavel, in Babylonia, and just say, on the evening of the 14th, on the night of the 14th, use the word that we normally associate with night. Why didn't he do that? So the Gemara suggests that this is in keeping with a teaching of Rabbi Yehoshua, where is he? Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, who said, we learned from the Torah that whenever possible, we nuance our speech to be less crude and more refined. Less crude, more refined. If there's a way to express ourselves which is more beautiful, more refined, more positive, bringing in fewer terms that imply negative concepts, unholy concepts, impure concepts, then that is a better way to speak. And now the Gemara is going to give a series of examples from the Torah. Right, first one from Bereshit, from Genesis, and this is a line in Genesis chapter 7, verse 8, and it says. So these are the animals that Noah is bringing onto the ark. It says, from the pure animals and from the animals that are not pure, they were brought onto the ark, right? So in this case, when they say pure, they're not actually talking about ritual purity or impurity. They're actually talking about what is kosher to eat and what is not kosher to eat, right? So a Jew can only eat certain animals. There's certain requirements. Fish with fins and scales. Those were not on the ark. But an animal that chews its cud and has a split hoof, certain birds, there are excluded birds, etc. The kosher animals, right? So from the clean animals, there was something to it, and then from the unclean. But it doesn't say the unclean or the unkosher or the impure animals. It divides them into the animals that are pure and into the animals that are not pure, right? So in other words, it says animals that are not pure as opposed to animals that are impure. Now, animals that are not pure requires extra words. Asher einena tehora. Animals that are not pure. It takes extra words, it takes extra letters. The Torah is a little bit longer because it used this expression, animals that are not pure, as opposed to animals that are impure. It would have said tamea, right? So that would have been related to tuma. Why does the Torah go out of its way? That it's a given among the sages that every letter in the Torah is there for a specific reason. And so if the author of the Torah, meaning God, includes extra letters, extra words, just to not say a word that implies impurity or uncleanliness in some way, then it's a lesson in refining our speech. Another example from Deuteronomy 23:11. If there be among you any man who is not ritually pure, here we're talking about tahara and tuma. If there be a man among you who is not ritually pure by reason of that which happened to him by night. Right, so here there's two things that are going on here. First of all, it's a few extra letters, a man who is not pure, as opposed to a man who is impure. And also, it doesn't spell out what happened to him, that he had some kind of a seminal emission by night. Rather, it says he had an incident by night, and we are left to understand what it is. Elsewhere, the Torah is explicit. It's not that it's going to be so dainty with its speech that it's going to introduce unnecessary ambiguity, but where the meaning is clear And it can be said in a more refined fashion with fewer words that are suggestive of, uncomfortable concepts. Then that is better. Another example here further on in the Bible, first book of Samuel 20:26. For he said, something has happened to him. He is not ritually pure. Surely he is not ritually pure. Right? So lo tahor, he is not in a state of ritual purity. It could have just said he is tameh. He is in a state of impurity. But it was a more refined term. And then this kind of idea of using more refined speech is summed up in a couple of verses from the book of Job at 15:5. And you choose the language of the crafty, meaning that one should be clever when speaking and avoid inappropriate phrases. And it says in another verse in the book of Job at chapter 33, verse 3, my words shall utter the uprightness of my heart. That which my lips know, they shall speak sincerely. And from this, the sages are going to derive that wherever possible, we're just going to go the distance and elevate our speech and avoid using unrefined terms. And of course, especially, we don't use crude terms or vulgar terms. Now, the example is going to be given over and over again. And then now we're going to have a couple of incidents. And actually, tonight's class is going to be a little bit short. I'm approaching the end, so if you have comments or questions, definitely put them in the comments so that I can come to your comments and questions. But sometimes we hear these examples and it almost seems like, wow, it's really pushing. I mean, like, when we're talking about the law of fluids and emissions and whether a person is pure or impure, really precision seems to be the most important thing. And as we'll see also, the sages place a value on brevity and not introducing extra words for no reason. But whenever possible, refined speech is better. And when they're talking about refined speech, I mean, honestly, they're talking about say pure or that something is not pure rather than say it is impure. Because somehow impure is about impurity. It's about some kind of distance from God. And when you use a negative and just say not pure, at least you're using the word pure, which, it implies the absence of impurity. We're going to negate it with the word not in front of it, but it still seems better. So when we see that they're being so careful with the nuances, well, how much more ought we be careful in our lives? Certainly not to use profanity, right? Certainly not to use profanity. I learned this lesson the first time I made my 7.5-year journey through the Talmud. I really tried to take this very seriously. I cleaned up my speech. And around that same time, our kids were born. And, when you have kids in the house, you really, you suddenly become very sensitive to the words that come out of your mouth or the words that other people say in front of your children. I mean, you just don't curse in front of children. Then the kids get older and they hear these things on TV, radio, movies, etc. They're out in the culture. You can't protect kids forever. And you can slip a little and find yourself, using vulgar expressions and God forbid, even profanity sometimes. But having spent a lot of time really working on refining the speech, and then when I hear a vulgarity or profanity come out of my lips, I almost like, I shouldn't have said that. I don't want to speak like that. When you take on this discipline of refining your speech, it's very powerful. You're doing it because you're a vessel of God, right? Your body, that's walking around in this world is a vessel for your soul, which comes from a very high and pure place. So your soul is riding around this world in your person. And you want to honor the Almighty who sent you into this world, your soul. Now you want you as a person to honor, that soul riding around inside of you, and refine yourself. and particularly refine your speech. And it's kind of amazing because when you really work on refining your speech, it's not about becoming self-righteous. It's not about being holier than thou. Forget about correcting others and telling them to refine themselves. That's not part of what I'm talking about now. When you just take this on yourself and really work on it, and you don't have to tell anyone you're doing it. But after a while, people notice that something is different about you. It's quite interesting. They notice. And the more you do it, the more that you do what the Gemara says here, it requires cleverness to really refine your speech. And so then you start to look for, just more elegant ways to say things, more positive ways to say things. And when you work on your speech in that way, all you're really doing is working on word choice. But you start to be perceived as a more refined person. And if you're going to be a visible person of faith, you're going to fly the flag, of being in God's army, as it were. It's very important to be a person who is perceived as working on themselves and as being more refined. It's very important, and it is worth the effort. Okay, so then there's a couple of incidents that were brought to illustrate this point, and just how far the sages took it. Now they're teaching each other, right? So any person should seek to elevate their speech. But when you're holding yourself out as a sage, right, as one of the Chachamim, as one of the sages who's then going to go and teach Torah out there in the world, how much more important is it, right? So there's an incident here. The Gemara relates an incident involving the use of appropriate language. There were these two students who were sitting before Rav and were weary from studying a complex issue. One of them said, "This law that we're studying, it's making us as tired as something else." Now, when he said as tired as something else, he's already showing that he's refining his speech, because what he meant was, I'm as tired as a pig, who wallows in the mud. But he knows better than to say pig, so he says it's making us as tired as a something else, by which everyone understands that he meant a pig, but he didn't say it. The other student said, well, studying all these complicated laws is making us as tired as a kid, meaning a young goat that I guess tires easily. So their teacher, Rav, would not speak with that student who made reference to a pig. As one who speaks inappropriately is undoubtedly flawed in his character, right? So this student revealed himself to Rav, at least the way that Rav perceived him. And he was disappointed with that student and, kind of distanced him from himself. Now, the student knew better than to say we're as tired as pigs. He said we're as tired as something else. So from here you learn that it's not only about word choice, it's about concepts. Right? You mean to say, maybe that was a popular expression, I'm as tired as a pig, and he didn't want to say that, and so he said I'm as tired as a something else, but then it was clear what he was saying. He should have chosen a different idea to get to express himself that they were so tired. The other student said, I'm as tired as a young goat, right? And somehow that's more acceptable. So, getting clever about how we express the ideas that we want to communicate is very important. Let me see this one. And then, you talk about how nuanced this could be. Another incident, there were two students who were sitting before Hillel. And one of them was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And some say they were sitting before Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. That's Rebbe, the editor of the Mishna. And one of them was the Amora Rabbi Yochanan. So it might have happened in two very different generations. No one is sure the origin of this story. But the point is there were two students in front of a big teacher. And one of them said, due to what reason need one be careful to harvest grapes in a state of tahara, in a state of ritual purity, by insisting on the use of pure vessels But one need not harvest olives in a state of tahara, right? So grapes, it's more important that we use vessels that are tahor, but with olives, it's not so important that the vessel is tahor. And the other student said, why is it that there's a difference that grapes have to be harvested in a vessel that is tahor, but with olives, it's okay if the vessel is tameh, right? So one said, why is that grapes can be harvested in a vessel that's pure and olives can be harvested in a vessel that's not pure? And the other student said, why is it that grapes can be harvested in a vessel that is pure, but olives can be harvested in a vessel that is impure? And because he brought, the second student used the word impure in his speech when he might have found a way to just keep his language to the concepts of purity. And the teacher, it's not that the teacher was mad at the second student or alienated him, but the teacher's comment was, this first student, who's so refined in his speech, I would not be surprised if he is issuing rulings in Israel very soon. And indeed, it was not a few days later that the more refined student was called on to sort of, graduate and not just be a student, but to issue rulings as a full-fledged sage, right? And his teacher could predict that because he had become such a refined individual. And then there's one more story. It's the same point. Here it wasn't sages, but it was about some priests. And the priests receive a portion of some of the offerings, some of the bread offerings that are brought in the temple. But because there were a lot of priests serving at that time, they each received a very small portion. One of the priests said, I only received a portion as big as a bean. The other said, I only received a portion as big as an olive. And the third one said, I only received a portion as big as a lizard's tail. Now that was an odd expression to use because a lizard is a sheretz. A lizard is an impure creature. It has no place in the temple. In fact, that's the last thing we were discussing at the end of Tractate Eruvin. What happens if you find such a creature in the temple? You got to get it out of there. So why was a priest who brings offerings on the altar using such a crude expression? The other ones noticed it, right? And they thought to themselves, we should investigate this guy. And it turned out that there was some flaw in his lineage, and he actually was not qualified to serve in the temple and to bring offerings on the altar. So the Gemara objects, wait a minute. Any priest who has already brought offerings on the altar, we don't investigate their lineage, because for sure, if they've come to the point where they're offering on the altar, God wouldn't let it happen. The other priests wouldn't let it happen. It's surely somebody who's qualified. And so when you're sort of, if you're investigating somebody's lineage and you go back, there's father's father, and then you identify a great-great-grandfather who brought offerings on the altar when the temple was standing, well, then that person's lineage is unquestionable because, somebody in his paternal line was a priest who brought offerings on the altar. We don't have to investigate any further back than that. So why would they investigate this guy just because he used a crude expression? And the Gemara answers, because when he used a crude expression, he cast aspersions against himself, right? A person who uses crude language, it's not just that they're unrefined, it's that it really makes others question who this person is and where they're coming from and whether they're qualified, in matters of great holiness. So, we're not sages, we're not priests, but the lesson is valid. Whenever possible, we should seek to elevate, to refine our speech, not to use crude expressions, certainly not to use profane expressions. Why? Because as far as the sages are concerned, we are what we say. Not what we declare ourselves to be, but we are what we say, in the sense that the language we choose to express our thoughts and observations about the world ends up revealing quite a bit about ourselves. All right, let us check comments and questions. Bill, fun fact. The ancient branches of Christianity carried over the Jewish calendar with some slight variations, which is why vigils are common before many Christian festivals, since the holidays still technically begin at sundown. We also got fed up with looking at the moon pretty early and tried to solve it with math, with, shall we say, mixed results. But I guess what Bill is saying is that the vigil of a particular holiday has that same idea as the Jewish calendar and Jewish holidays and any Jewish day, that it begins the night before. Dale says, I really appreciate you very much, and I'm wanting to learn more about my Jewish heritage. Shalom from my Jewish relatives, the Cohens and the Kleins and the Weissmans and the Katzes. Well, that's great, Dale. That is so great. You know, just so many of us, and I was in this group at a younger time in my life. You know, what can I say? It's like up until about 200 years ago, there were always Jews who wandered away from Judaism. There were always Jews who were sort of lost. They assimilated out into the culture and lost their Jewish identity, their Jewish heritage, their knowledge of Jewish law, Jewish culture, etc. That always happened in history, but it wasn't acceptable. You know, it was tragic when it happened. It was not considered okay as a mainstream idea among Jews. Tragically, in the last couple hundred years, since what's called the Haskalah, the Enlightenment in the early 1800s, you know, there came this idea that faith, and, you know, among Jews, obviously it wasn't only among Jews, this happened, you know, among all the faiths as well, but among the Jews, it was just so tragic because it's not just a religion, right? It's a tribal identity. And there were all these Jews who, you know, they were told by super intellectual, intelligent people, oh, you know, all this learning, all this teachings, all this, you know, so-called sophisticated reasoning from the Talmud. You don't need any of that. Science is a perfect substitute for all that religious claptrap. And just untold numbers of Jews flowed out of Judaism. And you know, that's just never been recovered. And so now, you know, I mean, the vast majority of Jews, you know, just know so little about Judaism and Jewish practice, Jewish language, what the laws are that obligated us, that our ancestors understood for over 3,000 years. Yeah, you didn't choose it, but you're a Jew. You were born into this. You're obligated. You have all these laws that you're obligated to follow. Why? Because God said so. We didn't sign on the dotted line. We're just born that way, and we're obligated. Of course, the amazing thing is that when we submit to those obligations, we learn, just as Bob Dylan said, you got to serve someone. And when you serve the Lord, when you submit to these teachings and learn what they really are, first of all, you start to learn how sophisticated this vast body of wisdom really is, and we learn how much meaning it adds to our lives. You know, and if you're not Jewish, well, I mean, there's just a huge body of wisdom that applies to non-Jews as well in the Noahide laws. You know, being a person who cleaves to the Creator and wants to serve, ultimately, how do you serve the Creator? I mean, He's perfect. There's not that much we can do for Him, you know, in addition to thanking Him, acknowledging Him, praising Him, etc. But ultimately, the way you serve the Creator is to take care of the other creatures. But when you acknowledge that you're all made by the same Creator and that we're all part of that human family for that reason, it's very special and life changes, and it's so worthwhile. Lynn says, at the end, Yochanan should have obscured his factual news. Really, why? Any business would require accurate reports. So that's one of the stories that we didn't talk about so much in our discussion tonight. But no, listen, you have to refine your speech, but you can't refine it so much that people don't know what you're talking about. Right? That's not okay. You'd absolutely need to be precise and clear, particularly when you're teaching. But to the extent that it's possible, we can certainly refine it. And vulgarity, profanity, there's never a reason for that stuff. Aham Svarupa, and I hope I pronounced that right, is the word for refined speech in Hebrew Aramaic from the Talmud related to the adjective subtle in reference to the serpent in Bereshis. I'm not sure off the top. I'd have to just study that a little bit. But in the book of Job, that one should be clever, and the serpent was the most clever of all creatures. I think it's said. Very interesting question. I'd have to look that up. I had a question yesterday. Somebody asked about the word for twilight, and it wasn't on the tip of my tongue, right? So ben hashemashos, right? So the period of twilight, which is neither day nor night. How long is it, right? There's actually only one moment when we go from one day to the next, but we're never quite sure when that moment is. So twilight is variously defined from as short a period as 14 minutes to as long as 72 minutes. And so when we're talking about going into Shabbos and coming out of Shabbos, since we're never quite sure and we don't want to violate Shabbos in any way, so on the way in, we look at the earliest possible time that it could be Shabbos, and on the way out of Shabbos, we look at the latest possible time that it could be Shabbos, and that's a 72-minute period, and so that's how we define twilight with the stringencies of both when it comes to Shabbos. But the term for twilight is sort of means neither one nor the other, right? And so that's ben hashemashos, right? Here we go. Okay, Melissa says refining one's word choice should also require one control emotional responses to everyday ups and downs. Absolutely, right? If we're going to refine our speech, as we saw, it's not just word choice, it's also concept choice, right? Which concepts are we going to use to communicate, whatever we're trying to explain? And along with that, how much control, how much refinement, how much nuance is going to be available to us? We say the first thing that comes into our head because we're having a strong emotional response. And anger is much worse than joy for interrupting or, for losing control of our speech. And that's one of the most important reasons why we really want to train ourselves to be joyful, right? It's a mitzvah to be happy. As Rabbi Carlebach always used to say, it's a mitzvah to be happy. And it really is, right? When we focus on gratitude and service, that's automatically going to elevate our emotional state. It's going to keep us away from anger, which is strongly associated with arrogance and sin. Whereas joy and humility and gratitude kind of all go together. And when we're in that state, we actually have much more self-control, and our word choices are going to reflect that. Sharon says, according to Rav Soloveitchik, the reason that some of the morning blessings are stated in the negative is that it requires a stronger distinction than by stating the same concept but in the positive. So there are times when distinction is significant. E.g., in other words, who has not made me a slave versus making me a free person. Right, so Nina and I were talking about this a few weeks ago, right? So sometimes in an Orthodox prayer book, there's certain blessings we say in the morning, and a man will say, bless you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has not made me a woman, right? And a woman will say, bless you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has created me in God's image, right? So it's a distinction there. And so people will say, oh, well, that just shows that this is such an old-fashioned and patriarchal and sexist religion. It's not, right? Why did the men say that? There's a lot of reasons given. One is, thank you for not making me a woman, because I'm not a woman, I actually have to do a lot more. It's like saying, thank you, sir, may I have another, that I owe all these other obligations, right? I'm bound by all the time-bound positive commandments that women are not bound by, right? So a man must pray 3 times a day. A man must wrap tefillin. A man must do all kinds of things that women are not obligated to do. And he's saying, thank you. Thank you for making me do all those things. That's kind of like the standard explanation for it. But I think what you're getting at, Sharon, is very interesting. And this is what Nina and I were talking about. So when you say, thank you for not making me a woman, or thank you for not making me a slave, thank you for not making me a non-Jew, So what is brought into your mind? The woman, the slave, and the non-Jew, who are people that in this system, which is a patriarchal system, have fewer rights than you do. If you're a free Jewish man, at least for certain things. So it could have said just, well, thank you for making me a Jew. It's like rah rah. Thank you for making me a man. Rah rah. But by bringing to mind the thing which you are not, you're clarifying the distinction, as Sharon says, but it's also bringing to mind the fact that the person who you're talking about doesn't have these privileges that you have. They also don't have the obligations you have. Okay, and so you're being thankful that you're obligated and have further ways to serve, even though it's difficult and it's time consuming, money consuming. Sometimes it could just be a pain to have so many obligations. But you also have certain rights and privileges that these other people don't have. And it should be on your mind, for example, slaves, right? You are free, somebody else is a slave. So that should bring to mind that you should be thankful for your freedom and that you have an obligation to free the captive. You have an obligation to look out for the welfare of the people that don't have the privileges that you enjoy. And so by mentioning that you are not one of them, you are mentioning them and making you sensitive to their situation and to their plight, as it were. And finally, Tom says the distinctions there are to show gratitude for not being a person who is exempt from certain mitzvahs. Well, I think you're saying exactly what I'm saying there. Great. So that's where we are. We're finished our discussion of Daf Gimel, page 3. With God's help, tomorrow night we'll be together at the regular time and go on with a discussion of page 4 here in Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud. Hope to see you then as we continue learning together on our 7.5-year journey through the Talmud. Have a wonderful evening. The or of tomorrow.